getting to be well known. Bert, this is maybe your third or fourth demonstration here?
Yeah, when I was in Calgary, we came up and did some here as well.
Remember you did one on your little screw chuck, and you did
That's
one
right.
on your
segmented platters.
epoxies, I
Yep.
believe, and a couple of times ago as well. So welcome again.
Thank you. I did the same demo in Edmonton last month, or the month before. Yeah, and it was well received. It was a lot of fun, and it's making pendants. Actually, I brought my wife's pendant with me. She graciously let me bring it. So if it doesn't come back to me, I'm going to be in big trouble. So here's a couple of samples of the finished ones that I made out of Cocobolo. And then here's some practice pieces as well. So which camera is the easiest for me to hold these in front of? Down here? Can you guys see what's in my hand? Yep. Okay. If you can't, just holler at me, because this is I'm a little bit out of sorts when I can't see the camera or can't see the video of where I'm looking at. When I'm setting up at home, I have a monitor that I've tied into the cameras so I can see where I am.
You put it right on top of the tailstock, it worked great.
There?
Perfect.
Okay. So this is jumping ahead a little bit to the pendant. When we get to making the pendants, there's lots of opportunities for design. You're only limited by your imagination. Some of these are like this is an offset hole. There was a 1/4 inch hole in the middle of this one when I started, but with the offset, that center hole goes away. So a lot of the pieces I start with are piece of wood with a hole in it, some without a hole. So it's small pieces of wood. Here's what happens when you get a little too carried away. Somebody told me I should make another one just like it and put the hole on the opposite side, and they call it earrings. Yeah. Right? So anything's possible. So how many people here have ever made pendants? Do you use a jig?
No, I just use two-sided tape stuck on a hub that's curved. I made it like cone.
Yeah. So that,
I use two-sided tape.
yeah.
Go pick them up across the shop. I don't know what time.
Yeah. Well, that's right. There's a lot of those kind of jigs out there that, and two-sided tape works good because it's inexpensive. You use a glue block. Hot glue works, but then you got to get the glue off. What I'm going to show you tonight is a jig. Here's one I made today practicing. But basically, it's a jig. It's just two pieces of wood. I hold it together with elastic bands. Right? So that's the piece we're going to make today. Then when you turn the pendant size, it just fits inside of here. And when you squeeze this in a chuck, this is tied into the chuck nice and tight. And you can come in on the side and cut a hole in it or cut some arcs. There's a few little idiosyncrasies that if you don't have it sized right and this happens to turn when the lathe's turning, I call that a design opportunity. That's what happened here. And when I seen it, I thought, hey, that's neat. I'm going to try to do it on purpose. I've never ever done it on purpose. I always do it by accident. Okay. And when it slips in the chuck, you can get things like this happen, where you're cutting here, and then all of a sudden you're on a different center, so it cuts in different places. So it can surprise you. The only critical thing with this chuck is the size of the disc and the size of your wooden chuck. And you have control of that. If you want to make big pendants, you make a bigger hole. If you want to make smaller pendants, you make a smaller hole. They just have to fit. And as you can see, I make lots of these. So for various different sizes. And when I was making them, this one's got oops written on it. I think you can see that. I'll pass that one around too. You'll probably figure out what I did wrong there. So it doesn't take a lot to do it, but what else here? I guess I'll just jump right into. You start with a block of wood. The critical thing for the block of wood is size it for the jaws that you're going to use. I use number 3 jaws on a stronghold. So the block of wood for the chuck only has to be big enough to fit in the jaws. I try to have the jaws close to a perfect circle, so for me it's about 94 millimeters on the outside. And that's as big a piece of wood that you need for the chuck. The width of the chuck is 6 millimeters in from one side. We'll put a V groove. That's where the chuck will actually grab it. Then there'll be another 6 millimeters on this side. So the actual overall width of the chuck when it's finished will be 12 millimeters. We use the extra material on here in order to put the offset. So you start with a block of wood. You mark center on it. Can everybody see that center? So there's a center mark there. And then 6 millimeters offset, you make another punch mark. And that's where the offset for the pendant holder is going to be. So without further ado, I believe, I usually start on center. I'll make it round. Let's see, can you see the chuck? Yes. Okay, so what I'll normally do, this is the side that's going to have the offset tenon on. So I normally would take a measurement here so I can get a rough idea where 6 millimeters is, and just put a mark, and 12 millimeters. So that's basically going to be the overall width of the chuck. And I'll turn it around. I'm not the best wood turner in the world, so bear with me if I get a few catches. Basically, I made that roughly 94 millimeters in diameter, and I'm just going to get a quick idea about where 6 millimeters, it doesn't have to be exactly 6 millimeters. The key here is that this has to be able to fit in the chuck without bottoming out. And this groove has to be big enough and wide enough so that it's easy to center it on your choke cross. Now on either side of that line, I need to put in some grooves to hold the elastic bands. On the way up here, I was talking with Stu, and I was saying I did a practice run on it, and I almost made the same mistake right now that I did when I did the practice run. I now need to make the 6 millimeter offset, and I almost turned the spigot on center instead of 6 millimeters offset. So hopefully I still have enough material here to do what I should be able to. I'll have to revise my notes to say put the tenon on first offset.
Do you just have that jammed against the chuck?
Yes, I'm just using a live center, and the piece of wood is just jammed friction fit against the chuck.
Okay.
So the center point in the live center digs into the wood.
Yep.
So if I have a catch, I've never lost one this way, but you guys have a good protection screen here.
That's why we put Al right in front of there.
Yeah. So I've got the grooves for the O-ring, or for the elastic bands. I've got the groove for the chuck to sit in, and I've cut a 6 millimeter tenon off on the side. And I did it to myself again. So what we'll do now is we'll mount the wooden chuck into the stronghold on this offset tenon. Move some of this stuff around. So what I like to have here is, because I turn these pendants I aim for 50 millimeters. So I need to get a 50 millimeter hole in it on the offset. I don't know if you can see that. So we'll get a rough figuring on, these dividers are set about 51 millimeters. Does everybody use dividers for finding a center or centering a hole on the piece of wood? Where you take the dividers and you put it against the spinning wood, but you only touch the left hand side, and then as the mark shows up, when it lines up with the divider on the right hand side, then the hole is perfectly centered.
Way more fun when you touch the other side.
Yes, it can be. Yes, it can be. I'll turn some light on here. You might be able to see that or not. Does that help? Can you see any better with the light on? Okay. It may help me when I start hollowing it. Oh, you're right, that's a little bit bright for what I'm doing here now. So I'll do this purposely out of line. That's a real small hole, so I just keep walking out slowly. It almost lines up. And that was 51 millimeters. So the hole that I want is, I want it to be 50 millimeters, so I'll stay inside that groove. I'm going to drill it with a hand drill, so I need a starting hole. I'm going to speed down a little bit. This hole is just for ease of drilling, so when I'm hitting it with a scraper or a bowl gouge or whatever, I've got a hole all the way through to the bottom. Two ways to do it. You could use a scraper or you can use a bowl gouge. I'll use a bowl gouge right now. use the box scraper to finish it out. The critical thing here is don't go too far. If you hear steel on steel, I made a mistake. Sorry? That's better. Can you guys see in the end grain here? And any comments you have on the video stuff, let us know, because we're practicing as well. So any angles that you can help us out with, that'd be great. So I think I've got that pretty much 50 millimeters, but I'll just double check this. And this is just like checking the straightness of a box. I want it 50 millimeters all the way through, and I got to go a little bit more. It's a little bit tight on the inside, just a little bit. This outside portion, if it's a little wider than 50 millimeters, doesn't matter because it's probably going to be gone anyhow. Oh no, I guess it's, that is 50 millimeters right there. It's the other side that's going to be gone. And so now we need to put the a little groove on the inside. A little groove inside. That should be about 1 millimeter deep and probably 2 millimeters wide. That's totally up to your own discretion. Basically, it's however thick you want to make your pendants, and whether you like them rounded or pointed, well, you would just make the groove in your pendant jig so that it'll accommodate it. That centers the jig where you want it, directly below the chuck jaws when it's in the jig. And if you want it rounded, then you just make your little V-groove rounded so that it doesn't damage the wood when you're cutting it. And again, I'd like to be about 6 millimeters in, so it's roughly there. And that's just so that the 6 millimeter groove in here is in line with the 6 millimeter groove that we put in the top. Did I get my head in everybody's way, or? Okay, that's good.
Keep trying.
I'll try again, yeah, I can always try harder. Okay, so that's got that portion of the jig. Oh, I still gotta put some burn marks on there. One of the things I've found working with a lot of the wood is that if you put a burn mark on it, it actually cauterizes the wood and makes it harder. Plus, when it's burnt, it makes it easier to see when you're putting it on the chuck jaws. Obviously, I'm on the offset. I should have burnt it before I switched to the offset mounting, but that's fine. It'll still work. now I'll switch to my stronghold with the number 3 jaws. I also have a talon that I use number 3 jaws on, so I can make smaller pendants. It's just kind of nice to be able to have the option. Now the moment of truth is put this groove in here, and you should be able to grab it with the chuck, and if it's the right size, should be able to spin it in the groove. And I've got a little bit wide, but that's fine. It's a little bit wider than a perfect circle, but for this chuck it'll be just fine. And I'll take this offset piece off, and then when you flip it around to cut the other side of your pendant, you'll put it in this way.
So you use those grooves that you put in it to hold it in the chuck jaw then?
Yeah, the center one that I burnt,
Yeah.
that's the center line of the chuck, and that's what holds. That's why it's nice to have it as close as possible to perfect circle, so you have metal and wood contact all the way around. Because when you're squeezing the pendant piece in, if this is 50 millimeters, this hole is 50 millimeters, right? So it's going to be loose. But I got to get some way to get this in. So when I do that step, you'll see why 50 millimeters is the accuracy of 50 millimeters, and 50 millimeters comes into play then in a few minutes here. So basically all I'm going to do now is just waste away this wood. So that piece is just about done. The chuck is just about completed. The next step is, let's see, well, I've got a lot more wood I can take off of here. I'm going to make it a little bit thinner on one side. If I take it off now, it's easier than, it'll have to come off anyhow, but I'm going to take off about 1/8 of an inch off of here where it's easy. Okay, now we need to make this into 2 pieces. I usually do this on a bandsaw at home. I didn't have room in my pickup for my bandsaw, so do the next best thing. Oh, I was going to say what I normally do too is I use one of these to get a line across center, but I think I can just eyeball it. But it's, you want to be able to make sure you cut this with the grain going this way. If you cut these and put the circle in where the grain is going this way, chances are the jig will break the first time you use it, because cross grain is not very strong, but long grain is fairly robust. I love these Japanese pull saws. They cut so fast. They cut really, really fast as long as you keep them sharp. So this saw is probably almost 8 years old, and the only time it's out of the plastic is when it's on wood. So now we can see why we needed 50 millimeter hole and then a groove inside about 1 millimeter deep. Now when we've got the saw kerf on there, chances are that hole is pretty close to 50 millimeters. Maybe not quite. This one might be a little bigger than 50 millimeters. But what I'll do now is I'll put some elastic bands on here, and then I'll measure the hole, and then I will make my pendants to fit this jig. So the pendants will be size on size or 1/2 millimeter bigger than what this hole is with the little groove. That way when I put these two together, there should be an air gap, you know, 1/32 of an inch air gap when it's holding a pendant, and then you know that you have really good wood to wood contact. Have you guys heard of Garry Rance? Anybody? Dave Spriggett is a UK turner. They do a lot of jigs like this. I had a challenge making some pieces for some crocheters, and I needed a way to hold small bobbins, so I sent an email to David Spriggett. I'd met him over in the UK when I was working over there, and he emailed me back and told me what he does, and it worked a treat. He does a lot of these little jigs. If you need something and your chuck isn't the right size, you just make a piece of wood and cut it in half and it works like a chuck. Like, it's so simple. But I would have never thought of it myself. Okay, so this is basically ready to go, and I can tell right off the bat I wasn't paying attention. I have this side 6 millimeters, but on this side it's way inside it. So for whatever reason, I didn't line up the inside groove with the outside groove. It'll still work, it just may not work as perfectly as I'd like. And I'll have to take more material off the chuck in order to get to the pendant. But basically, the chuck is done. So what we do now is we move on to making pendants. How are we doing for time? Time? How much time have we got? Oh, great, that's super, thank you. I lose all track of time, so I don't know whether I'm having to speed up or slow down or... Put a magnet on my pencil, so I always leave it on the lathe, and then I went and put my pencil somewhere else. So when I do these little pieces of wood, sometimes they're not very big, so I like to make sure that I put center marks on, just so I don't waste any. Sometimes I'm using a piece of cocobolo or African blackwood or ebony, and it'll be just big enough. I don't want to waste any, so I always try and find center. So these pieces of wood, I'm not even sure what this is.
So we're not worth anything?
Well, this is an exotic wood, but I don't know what it is. I just can't remember what it was. And this is big enough I wouldn't have had to worry about center. I could have just eyeballed it, but I thought it's valuable to say that there's a reason why it's good to learn or to mark center and conserve wood. Okay, so this is the one that, we wanna make sure we sneak up on. And, this is the chuck we just made, so this is the chuck we wanna fit it to. So I'll get a rough measurement on here. That's 50, that's probably 51. 51 millimeters, so I wanna make sure that, I sneak up on the pendant size. I'll set this for just over 51 and a half, so when I get this down to 51 and a half, then I'll shape the profile of the top, and that should be good. Again, this is bowl turning. A lot of times I'll use a spindle gouge on it, but it is cross, this particular one's cross grain. You can make these out of end grain as well. If it's a good dense wood, it works good. Seen a chunk of wood fly off there. I don't know if I lost a piece of it or not. Yeah, I lost a pretty good chunk. But it looks like I might still be okay. If I go to round, it might still be okay. So at this point I would sand it and finish it. I'd probably even take it and put friction polish or whatever finish I want to put on it. I would probably put it on at this point. And now is the true test. Well, that's a little bit too small, right? So this little pendant is going to go into my box of pendants, and I'll make another jig for it. Or if I have another jig here that's a little smaller, that won't fit in that one either.
Put a piece of tape around it?
You notice that's what I did on the one I handed around? And that's exactly right. That's what you can do. This one here looks like it fits in this chuck, and it grabs it. So this little pendant, even though it didn't fit in this one, I have another chuck that I made earlier, and it's just slightly smaller, and so it looks like it's going to grab it. So I'll just use this one instead. You guys have a knockout bar for this lathe? Box underneath? No, that's wood.
Oh, gosh.
Oh,
No, that ain't gonna open without unloading all that. I just said already.
You got your cord on your foot?
Thank you.
thank you.
Sorry about that.
Oh, not a problem.
Is that the extra meeting wing?
That's okay, I'll move it. So on some of the other chucks I made little grooves and put elastic bands on. But then I found out that if I put one of these big heavy rubber bands on, it just holds it in place a whole lot easier. And the chuck still fits. It still fits in there. The chuck jaws grab it just fine. And chuck doesn't fall apart all the time. I used to have trouble with the elastic bands would flip over and the pieces would fall out. And finally, when I found these big wide bands, it doesn't happen to me anymore. Pardon? Yeah, yeah. I got them at Shipper Supply. It's a packaging supply store.
Somewhere some kid's shin pads are falling off.
Yeah, yeah. Boy, you're dating yourself. I remember using sealer rings. That was back in the day when they charged us $4 to wear a helmet, and if you didn't pay $4, you didn't play hockey. I played hockey for 4 years before I had to buy a helmet. Now I'm dating myself. I always said I didn't really like wearing a helmet because it got in the way of my toque. Okay. I guess I should have put the pendant in the chuck before I put it in on the lathe. Oops. Sorry about that. Is that still working? Okay. So I'll take the pendant. There's what I say about the chucks always falling apart. The little O-rings or little elastic bands are even worse than the big one for this happening when you pull them apart.
So you don't want to do this after you've had a few beers the night before.
Probably not, no. Well, the next step, if you had a few beers, you probably end up making a whole bunch of practice pendants. Because this is the point in time where you can actually see that there's not much wood sticking out of the chuck. And what I like to do at this point is, because when this is spinning, it's really hard to tell where the offset is. And we do have to remove some wood here to get access to the pendant. So I like to find out where's the, I don't want to take any material off of this side. I want to be able to just come in, and I have to remove material on this side. But I don't want to take any off of here, or I'll have a really, really thin pendant like that one that I went around where I'd actually cut through the end of the pendant. So I like to put a mark on here, so now when it's spinning, I can see where I'm at. I'm just going to make sure this is squared up. Again, now this is bowl turning. You can do it with a spindle gouge or a detail gouge, but it is cross grain, so just be aware that it is a spindle turning activity. So you have to take some, the first time you use a chuck, you have to waste some wood away to get access to your pendant. Always a good idea to take a look and see where you're at when you're making a new one, because you spend enough time and effort making it, you don't want to have to make it more than once. So you can see I'm getting closer and closer to where I can cut the pendant here, and I'm still not cutting the pendant here, and that's about right. I just want to be able to break this edge so that when I finish the pendant between centers, I finish it far enough down the side that I'll be able to get in and do what I want to do at this side. can see I've got a really, really thin edge here. So basically, the hole is going to be right here, and if I come any further this way, I'll end up cutting through the pendant, so I don't want to do that. I'll come in from the other side now. And again, I've got a mark on one side, I've got to put a mark on the other side, so I've got a basic idea of where I'm at. So I definitely want to stay on the inside of that dark mark, so I don't take too much off my pendant. Here it's getting thin, so I'm just about ready to break through. Just want to take a look and see where I'm at. So here's a point where you have lots of design opportunity. On one side I'll leave this little raised portion. And on the other side, I could have made this a little bit smoother. I think I will. So on one side there'll be a little bit of a bump, and on this side here will just be a gradual taper. I'm always a little bit paranoid when I'm putting my hands in close to a chuck, especially something with a hole in it. So I got a little foam plastic brush, and then I can hold this in there, and if it hits it, it doesn't hurt anything. It doesn't hurt my fingers, and it's cheap. And it's really easy to replace the sandpaper. Okay, so that doesn't look too bad from my point of view. But again, you can have your own artistic license on making a pendant. You can shape it. You can put little designs by purposely slipping it like this. And now the hole is on a different center. So by slipping it in the jig, now you have a different center. That's going to make definitely going to make a different hole, like this piece here. That's what I did when I was trying this. So I did make one pendant where I made a series of these cuts, and I just turned it about 120 degrees and then just made a series of cuts. and it was kind of staggered around the outside edge, and it kind of looked kind of cute. But it's totally up to your own imagination. So this isn't sanded, but that's how it looks. And the beauty of it is once you make one of these, you can make as many pendants as you want, because the tricky part is getting the pendant size to fit the hole. And then the first time you cut the jig, you have to cut away some of the waste wood and get this tapered down so you can access your pendant. And I won't tell you how many of these I built before I learned that the hard way. But it's only wood, it grows on trees, so it's easy enough to get.
Bert, if you were at home, to make that jig a bit smaller, would you just sand it and put on a sandpaper or something?
To make the jig smaller?
Yeah, the original one you made today.
This one.
Yeah.
I could. You could take this on a sander and flatten it off. You could, absolutely, you could do that.
Wouldn't have made it too much off center, or?
I've done that on some, where sometimes I just squeezed it and ran it through the bandsaw again. So I got a thin kerf on a bandsaw, and it was still a little bit loose, so I just ran it through the bandsaw again. But you're absolutely right. You could sand it off on a belt sander or something and just take a little bit. And that's probably a good idea, because you're dealing with 1 millimeter or 0.5 millimeter is all you really need. But I make quite a few of these now, so whenever I make up a batch of these, I'll make a batch and I'll have my gauge set, and I might make 10 of them at whatever size. And I don't care what size they are, because I make them, and then when I make the jig, I make the jig to fit the pendant. And then it's good to go. Ended up with a whole bunch of these, and then the elastics would break, and then I wouldn't know which one fit where. One other thing that's interesting note, when I first started, this is one that I use as a prop, so it shows that I've got the burn mark for catching in the chuck here. It's got the offset tenon, but when you're drilling the hole and you're grabbing this on a chuck, there's not very much room between the end of this piece of wood and the chuck jaws. So I came up with something like this. And what I do on my on the smaller jaws, I put this in, and then I put this chuck on. So this is basically loose in the chuck underneath where it's jammed in the chuck. And then if I get carried away with my hollowing tool or my drill, I'm bumping into this, not my chuck. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to bump into this. So tonight I didn't use it because it was a little bit too big for the chuck I was doing, and I didn't hit my chuck, but I was paying attention. Sometimes when I'm doing this, I don't pay as much attention when there's nobody looking. Any questions? Any other questions?
Plywood you're using, or
Pardon?
what kind of wood are you using for your chucks?
This is maple. I've used maple, I've used oak, I've used poplar. Poplar's cheap and soft and cuts really nice. And it's soft enough that if you have a real dense piece of really good wood and you grab it in a poplar chuck, you don't have to worry about damaging your good wood. So hard maple is really hard. If you have a softer pendant, you might damage the edge. So softer wood on these chucks is better. You could probably make them out of pine. Might be a little bit soft, but maple or poplar works good. Hard rock maple is really hard. So, but if you get silver maple or East Coast maple, I think East Coast or West Coast maple, one of them is quite a bit softer. It's a little bit harder than poplar, but so you can basically make them out of anything. Any other questions?
How thick are the pendants?
Pardon?
How thick are the pendants?
The pendants? Well, I start with whatever I have scraps left over, and then I turn them down to whatever thickness I want between centers. And I don't worry about the center portion of the pendant when I'm turning it between centers. I only turn it down to the thickness I want here, because I'm going to remove this center portion when it's in the chuck anyhow, or I'll put some marks on it. But it can be as thick as you want. The only critical thing is that when you shape this edge that's going to fit inside the chuck, that's the only critical part there, that you need to have that little bit fit in the chuck. So you could have a fairly large pendant, a fairly wide one here, and taper it down. So you could make them round. You could put holes in them, offset holes, or you don't have to put a hole in it at all. It's just make a pendant, just a round on both sides. But what I liked about the one I sent around is on one side it has a profile bump on it, and the other side is like just a bowl profile, smooth profile. So people have told me they like to see something different on either side. I made a batch of player pieces for a backgammon game, and so they're a little bit smaller than this, or I think they're 1 inch in diameter. And the specifics they said is that both sides can't be the same. So that's when I started, whenever I make something like this, I never make both sides the same, because it's almost impossible for me to make two of anything. I can do one of anything, but when I try to make two the same, so and it's small pieces of wood, so, and you can make them out of any kind of wood. I've tried all kinds of wood. Some of them went in the fire pit because they just were bad wood. Birch that's spalted looks beautiful. It's absolutely crappy because it falls apart. It's too soft. If you treat it with epoxy, then it might not be bad, or soak it in CA and then turn it, it might not be too bad. Looks beautiful, but it falls apart. When it's this thin, it's pretty soft.
I really like the idea of turning the grooves on the outside and then burning it so you can.
Yeah.
Because I've watched you on YouTube.
Yeah.
You'll take stuff out of the chuck and put it back in.
Yes.
When I do that, it's never quite the same.
And that's why I started doing that. And I think Raffin was the one that told me that when I was did a workshop with Richard Raffin one time, and we were making some stuff, and he was always saying, when you put it back in the chuck, people will tell you to mark the jaws and whatever, and that's a good idea, put number 1 and mark it. So, but he says, better yet, if you know you're going to be just grabbing it on the edge, he's a fan of dovetail jaws. He says, do a dovetail and burn it, because it hardens the wood. If you don't harden the wood, then it'll make little indentations, and every time you put it on, it'll be a little bit different. But if you burn it, you're actually hardening the wood, and then it's real easy to seat, because then you could feel it. Like you can turn it when it's on the burn mark, and then when you crank it down, it's a perfect circle too. If you're as close as you can to a perfect circle, less damage to the wood. And then if you've hardened the wood, then it's even better. But yeah, I take stuff on and off the chucks now all the time with this, and I've had very little run out. I mean, you still have some, because some wood moves, but way better than what it used to be. Little tricks make life a whole lot easier.
Any other questions? Any last question for Bert?
No, Bert, sometimes what, I use, little pieces of, arborite for
Yep.
making my marks.
Yep, absolutely, yep. I use that on face grain, because when I'm going on the face, it's hard to get the wire to go stiff enough. So I use arborite going if I'm going to do it on the face. If I had to put a burn mark this way, then I would definitely use it. But arborite works this way as well. I just got used to using wire on the outside.
Thank you very much, Bert.
Okay. Thank you.